the book has over 700 actions to maximize cash flow with cost reduction. Many of them are technical in nature, involving optimizing designs or engineering or other dynamics which require some changes. But for this podcast, for your viewers, I would like to focus on a handful of actions that are at the executive level that don't involve changing any of the designs or any of the engineering or any of that. It's something that right after this podcast could be implemented to get 10%, maybe 20% cost reduction.
Boom. We're live from what looks like the Hatami library over here of a lot of books. The Oilfield Survival Guide, the latest book. There's a lot of books behind you, Hatami.
I enjoy reading.
Well, you wrote to most of the books that are sitting behind you. Yeah, they're just like duplicate copies. Okay, well, we have, by my accounts, my favorite engineer on the call today. Hatami and I started working together. Now is what, 11 years ago?
I think so.
That sound about right at American Energy Partners. And
Yep.
then we worked on 2, 3, like depending on how you count it, 3 ventures together. And now you have gone into full sort of author mode. And you've got now 2 books, and the latest of which we're going to spend some time talking about. And most of the time, guests come on here, and we just have a casual conversation about background and what the market looks like. But not Hatami. Hatami said the following, which is, I'm going to come on, and I'm going to give your guests a $10 million gift, $100 million gift, maybe even a $1 billion gift, which is, I'm going to tell them how to reduce their costs and their operations by 10 to 20%. And that's what we're going to get the roadmap from Hatami, the secrets over the next hour on what we're going to do.
Yes, that's what I would like to do.
Well, that's perfect. Okay, why don't we start with a little bit of background, okay, before we dive into all that.
Okay. I'm Matthew Hatami, engineer with over 20 years of experience. I've worked at Halliburton, Hess Corporation, Chesapeake, American Energy Partners, and then more recently working with the team, put a asset together, drilled wells, raised private equity capital, operated the asset, and then sold. I've worked within almost every discipline across our industry, from as a financial analyst, working on corporate strategy in Manhattan, to executing operations on the front lines across the United States and overseas, mostly focused on shale. I've spent the majority or a considerable amount of my time in the field. And for the past year or so, I've been focused on my new book, Shale Oil and Gas Operations.
Let's see the cover. Look at a beautiful cover right there, Matt. I love this.
Maximize cash flow with cost reduction. The book is written, it's written from the CEO's perspective on how to increase free cash flow by optimizing operations, reducing cost, improving risk systems and other processes. And it's designed to be handed out to the entire team from the field to the office, including all of the service providers and contractors.
And this is great. So now this is the second book. You want to, you already did a little show on this one. You want to just go ahead and grab the first one real quick, the Oilfield Survival Guide that we handed out as Link swag whenever we needed to raise money. That was sort of our little hat that we left for everybody. Look at that. That's a hardcover, baby.
This is my first book. It's approaching 10 years since it first came out, Oilfield Survival Guide, and it contains principles to working successfully in the oil industry. It's got over 1,000 cases in it. A lot of them I obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, including my own personal experience. But a tremendous amount of information is in that book. I've been told that it's in the offices of 80% oil companies. It's in 80% of oil company offices. I have no idea as to whether or not that is true. It's humble to think that it is, and I hope my new book can achieve the same level of success.
Well, like if the M&A spree continues, Matt, it's going to be in 90%. It's going to be in 95% of offices here if we're left with, half the number of oil and gas companies.
Well, that's a good point. I hope people enjoy it.
Okay. So let's start. Okay. You said step number one is kind of like if no one listens to the rest of this podcast, step number one has the most outsized value in terms of your view of reducing costs.
Yeah, I mean the book has over 700 actions to maximize cash flow with cost reduction. Many of them are technical in nature, involving optimizing designs or engineering or other dynamics which require some changes. But for this podcast, for your viewers, I would like to focus on a handful of actions that are at the executive level that don't involve changing any of the designs or any of the engineering or any of that. It's something that right after this podcast could be implemented to get 10%, maybe 20% cost reduction. We can get right into it, but as to what's going to have the most impact, it will depend on what's currently occurring within each individual company. But the first area to get an immediate result would be to focus on the invoices themselves, the actual documents that determine how much you're going to pay for each individual service. This is essentially the CapEx and the OpEx in your free cash flow formula. So if you get these down directly, you should see an immediate result on everything that you're recording, and also what your investors will see on your financial statements. So 95% of the mistakes on invoices favor the vendor. It's a very important dynamic to understand because the tickets and invoices can be full of mistakes that are working against you.
And they almost always are.
Yes, because your cost is their cash flow, and they're working very aggressive to ensure that they can charge for every possible thing, and they're looking at it from a biased perspective. So oil and gas operations are very dynamic. It's different than traditional manufacturing. I even have a table on it in the book comparing, manufacturing of widgets on a factory floor compared to oil and gas operations. And because they're so dynamic, it's reflected on the tickets with a bias against you in terms of what you are being charged. So the action is right after this podcast, what I'm suggesting that you do is for the next 60 days, require your entire team to document every mistake that they find on the tickets and invoices. Once you have all that information, it's very powerful as to what you can do to address this issue. You can incorporate it into your systems, processes, your artificial intelligence. You also elevate the knowledge of all your workers as to what should you be looking for the mistakes, or what I term in the book shenanigans, that are in these field tickets and invoices to extract the maximum amount of money from your company. Unfortunately, most of the time when an invoice or ticket is presented, it's signed with very little diligence, or it's pushed through an automated approval system. And the problem with that is if you're working very hard to reduce your costs, you're hoping that the actuals on the invoices are lower than what was bid, lower than what the vendor expects. And this is going to create tension because nobody wants to go out and do a job for less than what they're expecting to get. So they're going to push. Even if you're more efficient with your operation, it might not be reflected on the actual invoice.
So this is the issue, right? Everyone is spending time on the front end brainstorming where the cost reduction is going to happen, what vendors we want to pick based on some sort of bid. But the problem is once that's done, once that job is done, you've already elected that job, you're on to the next job. And so by the time the invoices happened, It's 1 month after the job or whatever the case is. No one is spending time comparing the original to the actual invoice.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. It goes even deeper, because it's like, to use a football analogy, we work so hard to get to the 1 yard line, and then right as you're going to score points, you just,
Fumble the ball.
yeah, you choke. And so many teams do that. They get right in the red zone. They're about to monetize their hard work, put points on the board, and they fold. Right? They
And is
fail.
that to you just a system issue versus a talent issue or diligence issue? Do you think it's just, too much time and attention is spent on the system leading up to the invoicing and not enough there? How do you? Why do you think this is such a big issue?
It's a combination. It's, most people choose the path of least resistance, which is just to approve an invoice or a field ticket, or send it through an automated system. And I'm a huge advocate of using artificial intelligence, but the systems need to be educated with data. So if you collect all the mistakes that you're seeing for the next 2 months, you can elevate the ability of your automated systems to catch the errors and mistakes. And a lot of it's very complicated, because some items are, there's more abuse within how they're being calculated, and sometimes there's actually even fraud. And I go through a lot of those examples in the book. I refer
What are
to a
the
lot of
top
this.
shenanigans that you see
Yes,
that are sort of common?
that's right. I refer to them as shenanigans, which is these types of bias mistakes,
It's kind of
abuse.
it's a generous term though. It's a
Yeah.
kind term because sometimes this is somewhat malicious and deliberate.
All right.
It's difficult to tell, but there definitely is some percentage of it that is deliberate and malicious.
Yes. And when you start to look into these mistakes and document them and catalog them, and then put them into a usable format for your entire team, you're going to catch a lot of stuff that was going on, maybe for a long time, and it just slipped through the cracks. We put so much work into the designs, the engineering, bidding, negotiating, and then executing to reduce our costs and be efficient. But when it comes time to put the same level of aggression into the looking at the invoice to ensure we're getting credit for all of our hard work, it often doesn't occur.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but most people, unless you're intimately involved with some of this stuff, don't know what to look at. Like if you put an invoice in front of somebody that's doesn't have a ton of experience building that invoice from working on the services side, they might not be able to find all the little tricks and games and bias that is being utilized to increase the costs. Like if you're running a cost reduction program, always remember your vendor is also trying to maintain their cash flow. So they're gonna be very aggressive, right? When you're at the 1 yard line in football, that is not the time to be modest. You want to be extremely aggressive. And the same thing occurs when you're diligencing tickets and invoices. You want to use every possible action that you can to get the number down. And you have to be super aggressive. I'm all about treating everybody with respect. The vendors are part of our team. I worked on the vendor side for 7 years. It's important to work with good people and have an environment that is enjoyable to work in. But when it comes time to approve those invoices, you must be extremely aggressive and do everything possible to get that number down as low as you can, because all of the hard work doesn't count if those invoices they're not going down. And usually, unfortunately, they're going up because everybody is pushing them up. Somebody has to push back.
So
And
you've got you told me a couple of, call it the table of scams last time we talked. What are the top scams that you have personally seen / you've done some research on?
I have a list of them. There's of shenanigans regarding this dynamic of our industry. There's over 50 listed in the book. I was showing you a few of them here. I can
Look at that
put
table of scams.
put that on there, but that's
You don't want to be on this list.
yeah. These are like invoicing shenanigans, kickbacks, uh, bidding, conflict, operations. There's so many dynamics at play that I wouldn't say there's like one that's more significant than another, but a lot of the more recent ones involve taking advantage of the digital technologies because everybody's is going to paperless systems
Yep.
with automated approvals and artificial intelligence. And so once there's a weakness identified in those systems, it's typically exploited. For example, and this is I've seen this plenty. There's very well known cases, but let's say you have a threshold of which, if there's an invoice below a certain amount, you send it through an automated process, which is touchless and doesn't involve any human verification. People will take a larger invoice and break it down into smaller invoices to get it under that threshold so that it gets approved without any pushback.
And you
So
did research on a well-documented case on this, right?
yes, there's multiple well-known cases, but one of them, the more famous ones that's publicly known, is a case which a person in a senior position or some level of knowledge of how invoices were being processed through the electronic systems started his own service company. He left the operator, started his own service company, and began doing work for his former employer. And he knew the threshold and how the systems worked and started submitting fake invoices below the threshold to the tune of over $4 million over a long, extended period of time. And the only reason that he was caught was that he submitted invoices for a location that had been reclaimed, and so like that was the first tip that
Trigger.
yeah, the trigger. And but this happens. This is actually it's very common, and it often goes unnoticed. So the action, what I'm saying, to do after this podcast is when you start documenting all of the mistakes, your team will start looking at the invoices at a much greater level of detail and be more thorough to find the mistakes so that they can list them. A red flag would be if you ask your team after this podcast to list all of the mistakes they're seeing for the next 2 months and you don't see very many. You should see hundreds, if not thousands, of mistakes over a 60-day period. If you do not, that in itself is a red flag, because these documents are created by humans during a process where there's a significant amount of
Extremely high error rate. Yeah, extremely
because of
high
the
error rate.
incentive. You got to
Yeah.
remember,
Yeah.
people do what they are incentivized to do. And
Right.
I know you've said that. You say the same thing. I know you think the same thing.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So when they're generating these invoices, it's as critical as it is for the operator. It's like 10 times more critical for the service provider
100%.
to charge every possible penny that they can. They definitely don't want to undercharge because you can get in a lot of
No.
trouble for doing that. If there's any uncertainty, you charge for it. You have to. You have to do that as a service provider. And because our operations are so dynamic and no operation goes exactly as planned. We've worked together for a while. I used to say that
Exactly.
all the time.
Yeah.
No operation goes exactly as planned. We have to be ready for anything because anything can and will happen.
And
And
I've never seen the actual lower than the AFE, Matt. Never seen it. It hadn't happened to me, at least. Maybe once in my life it'll happen, but haven't seen it.
well, there's another interesting story that happened to me earlier in my career. Is I was approving multi-million dollar invoices, and I just happened to be on location for a frac invoice review, and I reviewed it with the team and we signed, and then typically that invoice would go to a higher level within the company for the second approver. But for this particular case, it came back to me, and it came back at a higher number than what was originally approved. And I only caught it because the number looked off, and it was recent. So I dug into it and talked to this particular company, and they said that they do this all the time. And looking back on the invoices, that's exactly the case. They were changing invoices after they had
Between
already been
approvals, yeah.
approved, and they were changing them on all the documents, so you couldn't catch it. Like the automated system will not catch that, and they thought it was acceptable. Of course, this was a huge violation from an ethical perspective, and we released him for that particular reason. But I'm hearing from my colleagues that as more systems become fully digital, this is becoming more of a problem recently, where things are being changed after they've already been reviewed. So
I think you
unfortunately,
told me a story about like invoice approval seems to be like bottom of the list fun activity for
it's not
people
a
who are
priority.
highly motivated.
Yeah.
Operations, like you're making oil and gas. Like this is a very like it's a real like you have some real stuff going on. Approving invoices seems like the worst thing you could possibly be doing and spending your time on. So I understand why this happens, but you had a good story on this.
Yes, I mean I've seen, the story. I know what you're referring to, and this is a story that I've seen at multiple companies, and it's shocking to hear, but it's absolutely true. And I've seen cases where engineers that have like senior level approval authority and managers, what they'll do is they'll let the invoices build up to a certain amount in their invoice inbox on the digital systems, approval systems, and then they will race each other to see who can approve more invoices faster. It's like a game. And when you're playing this game, you're not really looking at the invoices, you're just trying to get them approved and get it out of your inbox. So if you're sending invoices directly to the office, which a lot of companies are doing now with no review in the field, is anybody actually reviewing them? And it's a
This sounds
question.
like a very expensive game that they're playing.
Exactly. The path of least resistance is just to approve them, because it takes a lot of time if there's a problem, especially if it's already at that point. The best
Right.
place to correct them is while they're being constructed, before they ever get into the system, because it's simple. If somebody presents an invoice to you as they're building it, either in the office or on location, you can just say, hey, look, there's this problem, this problem, this problem. Just correct it right now and send, and come right back 2 minutes later, I'll sign. But once it gets into the system, it becomes a little bit more involved to fix it. And very frequently, if you're going through them, with a fine-tooth comb, and you find problems, it doesn't like it's not rewarded inside
Yeah.
of most companies. Like it's not something that's highly valued,
If you
because
had to take the average well, let's say like an average Permian well, let's say, yep, for round number sake, let's say you got a $10 million well. That's not even like a multi-well pad, just one well. What percent fat do you think is in the invoice error on any given well?
it's at least a couple of percentage points, if not more, depending on how you approach invoice review. Like for me, it's not see, we work so hard to get the cost down that the process of approving the tickets and invoices is another opportunity to reduce your costs. That is a tremendous opportunity. It's not a nuisance or a waste of time, which it's often looked at as that low value task. This is it's often referred to as a low value task. But what I talk about in the book is this is the opportunity to ensure that your costs are as low as possible, and to work to further push them down. The vendors, they're not going to push them down. The automated systems are not going to push them down. You have to do it. You have to push them down. You have to be extremely aggressive. in order to get
And
your
they're going to
costs
take
down.
they're incentivized to take as much as they can without getting fired, right? Like let's be honest on how that works. So,
Yeah.
okay, so invoicing opportunity number one, where do we go next? So let's say, okay, we go back, we spend some time, we have a team, we build our little Doge team that goes in and says, okay, let's go look at invoice error rate and, document that for the next 2 months. What's the step number two?
The next step would be also on the invoices. I would, right after this podcast, I would request that the finance team, working with the ops team or just the finance team, so there's no bias, tell your finance team to do a full statistical analysis on the structure of your invoices, the actuals. How are
Okay.
you being charged? Because by making small changes on the structure, you can get the cost down. So, for example, maybe you're paying for something on a per day basis or per
Okay.
hour. Does it make more sense to pay per foot?
Right.
Like, of course, it's going to depend on the variables, but based on what you're seeing on the actuals, we can change structures to further reduce costs. Another example, and you can get very, very granular, much more than you may think. The frac tickets are usually the single biggest item today
Yep.
on a shale well, in most cases. So most people are paying on some type of time based metric. Very often it's per minute, like a charge per minute, and so the question to ask from a structure perspective is, when do those minutes start? Is it when the well is opened, when a certain rate is reached? This small dynamic with the structure of how you're being charged has a tremendous impact, especially when you're doing, thousands of frac stages a week, or depending on the size of your operation. The other dynamic is, if you don't reach an optimum rate or the designed rate, are you still paying the same amount? And is there a minimum threshold? Because here's where some of the structure can incentivize bad behavior. Let's say, for example, your frac job is designed to pump at 100 barrels per minute, but the team is only able to get 80. Now you have a situation where you're being charged the same amount per minute, the job is taking longer, and your production performance is going to suffer. So the numerator and the denominator are impacted, and the vendor makes more money, which is a very common structure. So there's a tremendous opportunity to look at how we're being charged and make adjustments based on the actuals to reduce the cost. And this is an action that doesn't require changing anything regarding the design or the technical aspect. It just is from a financial perspective, how can we restructure our pricing to reduce our cost?
And that kind of leads into, let's say, bidding, right? So that, this is some gray area between invoicing billing, which is how do we structure our procurement of various services, right? How are we charged ultimately on some sort of construct? And that leads you into bidding. What
Yes.
what do you think needs to be done there?
To get this action alone can get you 10 or 20%, depending on what's currently going on within your operation across multiple divisions. But the bidding is a huge opportunity. And what I suggest implementing after this podcast within your company to see a significant reduction is establish a minimum number of companies to bid for every service, no matter how small. My recommendation is to set a minimum of 10 service companies to bid for every single service, no matter big or small. And this addresses a lot of dynamics within the company, because it's very common to bid 3 vendors, 3 or 4. It's called 3 bids and a buy, and it's an engineered bidding process to ensure a specific result. So if you have a vendor that you want to use, and you're a field superintendent or an engineer or a manager, and there's a particular vendor that you want to use, which is pretty common, you take that vendor and you surround them with someone that always bids out of the ballpark high. You put a high bid next to the one you want to use, and then on the other side of them, you put a low quality company.
Garbage vendor.
Yeah.
Garbage vendor, yeah.
And this ensures that you're going to pick the same vendor that you've
You're gonna
always
pick your
picked.
buddy. You're gonna pick your buddy.
Everybody does it, and it elevates your costs because that vendor knows they're going to win,
Yeah.
and they know the game that's being played. 3 bids and a buy. When you go to 10, you can no longer do that. It's just too many vendors.
There's too many opportunities to kind of change inertia.
Yeah, this action alone will put pressure on your current vendors, even if you want
This
to keep.
action alone is going to bring a lot of Chick-fil-A breakfast to your office and your
It'll
kitchen
do.
as well.
It
If
can
you
do
got
that
10
as well.
bids on everything that you do.
And the other thing it does, Raj, and I know you're going to love this because I know you like artificial intelligence and information, is that when you're talking to 3 times as many vendors, the amount of data that is flowing into your company is tremendous, and that information can be utilized to lower your cost. The vendors
Right.
see so much in the field, so when you increase the amount that you're talking to because you're bidding so many more people, the quality of information that comes across is huge. You just have to put systems in place to utilize it.
Yeah,
So
you're going to get a lot more information. The question is that a distraction or not? And so you have to be like quite careful about um getting all that information. Obviously, if you're going to bring in 7 new vendors to talk to that you ordinarily wouldn't, you're probably going to learn quite a bit, and they're probably going to share a lot more than your existing. If you already have an incumbent like it's an inertia bid, right? Someone you already work with all the time, you have some version of a relationship. If someone else is coming in to sort of bake off and bid against that, they're going to put their best foot forward because it's new business, right? Like, rightfully or wrongfully, everyone puts in more work to get new business than to just keep their existing business happy. Maybe that shouldn't be the way we approach business, but that seems to be the case, at least on the OFS side with an upstream operator.
exactly, yep, I agree completely. So it's just a tremendous opportunity to further put pressure on everyone, and I think you're going to find new providers. And if you're also looking to restructure your costs and the pricing structure, like how you're being charged, new vendors may be more open to making those changes.
Now, walk me through. There's examples of funds implementing strategies like this, and even larger scale operators. But let's say more of the private equity funds that kind of do this, which is okay. We know we have a team that's going to go bid out some frac job or a series of frac jobs. Let's bring in a quote consultant that sits sort of in between, and the presence of that consultant and that consultant is getting a lot of information across multiple basins, multiple vendors, whatever, and they can ensure more or less that our team is not going to get scammed in any sort of way. Do you think the presence of some sort of bidding consultant or third party consultant on the procurement side, particularly let's say like the larger line items of either say let's say frac or drilling, do you think that's ultimately going to be cost saving for an organization, or do you think it's kind of a hit or miss?
I think it definitely adds value because on the private equity side, you may not have a supply chain division as
Yep.
when like if you're working for a large operator, you have a whole division that's focused on supply chain and a lot of people that are helping to with your costs. And private equity usually doesn't have that. So bringing in a third party to help ensure that the teams are being as diligent as possible and getting as lowest the lowest cost as possible, I think it adds value. Of course, it depends on the individuals that you're bringing in, but it definitely puts pressure, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you bring in somebody else to kind of audit what's going on operationally, it definitely
Just
puts
the notion of
yeah.
the vendor hearing that there is another set of eyes, another approval layer, whoever that approval layer is, it seems like it's going to add some pressure.
It adds pressure not just to the vendors, of course it does there, but also to the teams themselves
Right.
because there's someone else looking over your shoulder to ensure that you're getting the lowest cost possible. So I think it adds a lot of value.
Okay, well let's see who's going to do 10 bids. That's sort of aggressive. Okay, this sounds like the Matt Hatami special. 10 bids, 10 bids to make sure that there's no conflict.
Cost reduction is very hard. I did a ton of research for this book, and I looked at what other industries are doing to see what could be learned, because I wanted to bring something new that nobody has ever seen before. Of course, there's a lot of tried and true methods in my book, but there's a lot of stuff that nobody has seen, and I looked at a lot of other industries to see if there were learnings, and what I found is a lot of what the oil and gas industry struggles with, so do other industries, and it turns out that management, especially executive level management, at a lot of other industries, spend a considerable amount of time on cost control and reduction, because it's something that if you're not putting pressure on, it can very easily spiral out of control. And the oil and gas industry is definitely within that sphere, because there's so much money moving around to operate, and when that occurs, it's easy that if you take the pressure off, it just naturally goes up, and just um, people take advantage.
Yeah,
So
there's a cost story, but then you also told me a story around just like how fragile everything in the business is, where it can come down to one person not showing up on location one day, resulting in just a terrible a series of situations. You want to
yes,
walk through that one?
yeah, there's a story in the beginning of my new book in which I explain how a well site pumper, a lease operator that tends to the wells on the production side, ended up damaging the market cap of a publicly traded company. And so, what I'm trying to illustrate with that story is that the people that we work with are the most important dynamic of maximizing free cash flow with cost reduction. You must have good people, otherwise, something that's very difficult becomes impossible. And in this particular case, it was winter operations. The pumper needed to return to a multi-well location, new location. It had like I think 20 wells on it. There was a lot of wells on this one particular location. There was a central tank battery to get a return to uh, turn off a heater treater burner and flush a regulator and make some adjustments. And instead of doing that, he decided to go home because he had dinner plans with his family to go out to dinner. And while he was at dinner, the SCADA alarms started triggering, and they were ignored or missed. And a fire occurred, and a farmer called the emergency line, and by that time the entire location and the entire tank battery was on fire, and it was a total loss, and it made the news. And a fund manager in New York, an institutional investor, which was monitoring for this particular company on social media and other sites, through automated alerts. You all get them, and he saw this was occurring. It was picked up by the local news, and it made him, for one reason or another, uncomfortable with his investment. And during the next oil price increase, he slowly sold off the position, which was then picked up by the investor relations group within this publicly traded company, and they scheduled a meeting because they want to know why did he sell his entire position. And he didn't disclose why he sold, just he had a change of opinion on his investment, and he didn't mention anything to the investor relations group, but he did mention to other investors. And once people became unsettled with this particular company, the value of the equity performance relative to its peer group started to decline. So you never know, you know, if somebody's action or inaction is going to have a huge impact. You look at some of the biggest cases um, in the oil industry in terms of undesirable situations, and very often they come down to uh, the actions or inactions of
A single
a
person.
particular a single person.
Yeah, single person.
I have a table in my new book of CEOs that have been fired
You don't
due
want to be on
to
the list.
no,
That's
you
not
don't.
the list you want to be on.
Yeah, you want to do everything you can to not make it onto that list. But if you think about it, if you look at some of these situations, it was the actions of a person within the organization that were not favorable, and it resulted in the chief executive officer losing his job. So, you know, and I talk about how to prevent that from occurring. And it's with strong systems and processes. And artificial intelligence is another one. I think it has a huge potential opportunity to enhance the value and reduce risk for our industry. And I think that AI, of all the industries that it could potentially create value for, the oil industry is close to the top on that list, in my opinion, based on a lot of research that I did to write this book. And I try to incorporate how we can utilize artificial intelligence throughout my book. And one of the ways you can do it is to avoid those types of situations by elevating the intelligence of your entire team. Again, like good people, it's so critical to have excellent people at every level within the company. And that is something that should definitely be a priority, especially when it comes to cost reduction and maximizing free cash flow. Because if somebody on the team is not interested in the strategy, they can do a lot of damage.
It sounds like at the end of this, this weekend, we need to create a Hatami AI, and people are going to go. There's going to be, call it, paywall a little bit. I don't know how much you got to pay, but it's effectively, what would Matt Hatami do based on the question that's asked, and like sort of the $2. I think that's a great little starter kit on your AI idea.
I think it could. You don't have to do that. All you have to do is buy the book. And I think it would help your team enhance their intelligence to avoid some of these situations, right? Like the best way to avoid learning the hard way is to learn from the experience of others.
So how do you square that story around the pumper and then the cost reduction piece, right? Because I think the view on cost reduction is, oh yeah, we're going to open ourselves up to, like, conceptually sounds really good, but then we open ourselves up to these sort of situations, whether it's because someone feels slighted because they're not getting paid enough, or we're cutting too many costs, or people just like, it does not make people happy, right? Like the idea of cutting costs, you and I have talked about this a lot. It is a miserable thing, right? Like people do not, right now we're already seeing it with some version of Doge. Like, yes, the principle behind it can be very interesting and probably a very noble and good cause, especially for whoever is the underlying investor. However, it has a repercussion that, makes people very unhappy.
I agree. What's happening, what we're seeing with the government with the efficiency and cost reduction, it doesn't surprise me at all because people don't like cost reduction. I go through that dynamic in the book because I think it's important to understand from perspective of the laws of human nature. Most people want to consume more. They want more. They don't want to reduce. So it goes against the human psychology when you start to push on costs. It's fun to spend money, and make more money. That's everybody loves that. But when you start reducing,
They
people,
don't like it. They don't
yeah,
like it, Matt. We've seen it. They
yeah,
don't
you're
like
seeing it right now at the highest level. People do unexpected things. I have a table in my book on statistics, workplace statistics, and in general, in any company, 18%, they say, based on analysis, 18% of the workforce is working against the interests of their employer. You start a cost reduction campaign, aggressive, and I'm pretty sure that number is going to go up. It's just a function of it, and that's why making sure you have great people is so critical, because you don't want somebody on the team that's not interested in maximizing free cash flow or takes some aspect of it personally, which is hard not to do. I've been in situations as well. You work very hard on the costs, and then
Yep.
somebody comes in and says it's not low enough, which is very common in all industries, and nobody likes to hear that.
No one likes to hear it. And look, you have to be overly ambitious here. Otherwise, you're never going to hit whatever target. Like you have to be, you have to have some target that is extremely unreasonable
Yeah.
to land on something that's going to be good. So that, that's one piece. I think the second piece, and you and I saw this, is when you go through a cost reduction campaign, what you find, and this isn't always the case, but there are going to be a lot of people that kick and scream. And what you find is the people who are kicking and screaming are somehow beneficiaries in one way or the other of a lot of money being spent.
That is true. And it's usually a red flag as to like why is there so much pushback. So, it's just part of the process, and there's, things you can do to address it. And my experience with it, and I think this is really important, but it's not nice to hear, but if there's someone that's not interested in reducing cost, maximizing free cash flow, or whatever your primary objective is, instead of wasting a lot of time and energy trying to get them on board, it's best just to move them to a different division or let them go. I've spent a lot of energy trying to get teammates on board that weren't interested in certain aspects of a company's corporate strategy, and you end up spending more time on that than on reducing your cost or enhancing your financial situation, and you can't afford that because this is already so incredibly difficult. But it's so critical, because if you can get your costs lower than your competitors, their assets become more valuable under your control. I go through like all the reasons why it's a noble pursuit to reduce your costs in the book. And one of the biggest from a human perspective is if you study global conflicts and wars, very often what you find is that these events occur because one country wants access to low cost resources.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody likes to talk about that. That is often the reason for these big conflicts and wars. So if we work hard to reduce the cost of oil and gas, we reduce the risk of
Needing to try to control someone
yeah.
else's resource.
So,
Yeah, which makes
I
sense.
try to, when people start taking it, personally, or they get upset because of some aspect of cost reduction, look at the bigger picture. Look at what we're trying to do. I mean, being able to significantly reduce the cost of energy has a huge impact on every
The
person.
industry,
Yeah.
across the board, right?
Yeah.
Like, every, some version of cost reduction spills over to other operators by virtue of the vendor network anyway, right?
Yes. I mean, like I am very passionate about free cash flow and cost reduction, and I think like even this podcast and
Well, we
getting
know, Matt, you wrote a book on the subject, so we
getting
can see the
but
passion.
the question is why? Like, why do you care? Because if you truly do believe that it helps humanity overall, then it's worth your time and effort to pursue it, as no matter how hard it is, and you take things less personally when you're trying to reduce costs from something that you have an attachment to, or some design or aspect of the operation that you work very hard on.
This is what you tell Val when you're working on the book at 1 a.m. You say, "I'm doing God's work on cost reduction in oil and gas."
You have to stay motivated, and I spent many nights, into like 1 2 3, and you just keep, if you start writing and you come up with an idea, you don't want to stop, so it messes up your sleep cycle and to try to get the book done. But that's exactly what it is. It's a lot of late nights, and fortunately, my wife is very understanding, and I'm very thankful for that, because it's hard to step away from a standard job and then do this. It's which is probably why there's no book out there on it so far. Like it doesn't make for the author. It's it's quite an ordeal. It was a ton of work. The book is almost 800 pages, but it touches every aspect, and I wanted to put out a product that is a solution to a problem in one book, not do like multiple books, which I could have done that, but I didn't really want to do that. But
Sure. Okay, so we stopped at bidding.
yeah,
What do we?
yeah.
What's next?
The next action that I would suggest is what I call extreme benchmarking.
Extreme benchmarking.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
not just benchmarking. Now we're going extreme.
you got to go extreme, and corporate benchmarking for people that work on the on the finance side and on the corporate side, when you look at your peer group and make a comparison to how you're doing to a bucket of peers and different financial metrics, we'll know what benchmarking is, and that is important to do. But what I'm talking about is going to an extremely granular level on the operations side to get a ton of data on what all the competitors are doing, and then leveraging that information to reduce your costs and risk. So what you want to do with extreme benchmarking is on every step of the operation, we want to get all the learnings, successes and failures from all the companies around us, and then put that into a usable format that our team can digest. For example, a casing failure is catastrophic. It can sink an oil company, and it has. And I go through examples of it in the book. One of the ways that we can avoid this from occurring is by studying all the casing situations around in our area of interest. What casing are people running? What are the specs? Where are they getting it? Where is it being manufactured? What are the issues? How are they running it? Is there a failure? Let's say, for example, there's a failure in a string of casing in our area of interest, and it just happens to be something that we were considering purchasing. And these are large purchases, millions of dollars.
This is not even hypothetical. We did this.
Yeah, we did this.
We
at
went
length.
through this exact exercise. There was a series of casing failures.
Because, as you know, we could not afford a failure. It would have destroyed us. And so we went to the ends of the earth to gather every single failure that happened within our area, within our basin. And we did. And some people may ask, well, how do you get all of that information? And I go through it in the book. There's a ton of sources. It's out there if you're willing to go gather it. And it helps
But you could
avoid.
also do this in an afternoon, which is you could just roll calls with the 10 vendors in the area and the 10 operators that you know in the basin and say, have you heard of any recent casing failures? And there is no way you're not going to get some leads on what those answers are in a couple of hours.
Yeah, and if you recall, there were multiple private equity operators having casing failures at the time before we drilled our initial well, and so it was a concern, right?
Yeah.
Because we couldn't afford for that to happen.
It came down really to the joints in that example.
Yeah, it happened to other people. There were like multiple companies that went out of business, big ones, like 100, like very large private equities that had a whole string of casing failures, multiple failures, big problems, and people were having they were happening during frac jobs. They were safety events. It's so expensive, and it's so damaging that you have to institute extreme benchmarking. You cannot operate in a void. You must know if something is failing.
This version that you're talking about is more, less on, let's say, individual line item cost reduction, but more on what are the catastrophic things that you can run into from a well performance perspective. And one might be a casing failure. One might be, a
wellhead issue, a stack issue. But I am an advocate for going to an extreme level of detail with every single line item, because you don't know where you're going to find that valuable piece of information. It could be a frac stack opportunity. It could be something else somebody is using, like how are our competitors geosteering the wells? What technologies are they using to gather their subsurface intelligence? There's so many things that you can do. If another company is outperforming you production wise, if you do extreme benchmarking, you might get to the answer as to why that's occurring. Are they using some type of technology during drilling to stay in zone? With extreme benchmarking,
here is forget about competitive intelligence from a finance and transactional and stock price performance perspective, but rather think about it on a call it the high level that everyone's probably thinking about it is a well cost and a well performance perspective. Okay, great. We understand that. Everyone understands that. If you're comparing against your basin, whatever. And like maybe some of that just has to do with the rock is better. Okay, great. Like we could sort of rank that. Your viewpoint here is, no, let's get like extremely granular on, okay, these are the 10 sort of failure points that you can run into, and these are the 10 performance points that we can run into. Let's find out what vendor they're using and whether or not they're outperforming on a cost or performance basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's you can get the thing about the high level metrics that bankers are looking at and this type of thing is that it's not granular enough to do anything. Like you can know what someone else is.
Well, it's the output to something. It is not the input, right?
Yeah.
That is the output of the last 6 months or 1 year. It's a lagging indicator. It's not a forward-looking indicator as much as you want it to be of future performance, right? It is the output of the last year of operational success in many ways.
Yes, I mean the value is in the details.
Yeah.
The details that you could find as to what your competitors are doing. Not to copy them necessarily. Maybe some in some cases, but we want to learn from their successes and failures. We want to know their operation better than they know their operation, so that we can leverage that data to outperform them.
We never really talked about this idea, but like, do you think there's ever an idea, which I thought was like quite relevant when we were operating, which is what if you just extremely cloned the best operator in the basin? So you effectively said, I don't want to go through the minutia of every single decision point, every single vendor, all I want to do is that high level benchmarking. This says, this is the best operator in our basin. Here's why, right? Like they just out operate everyone else unequivocally. I am going to do everything in my power to just clone what they do, like just to an nth degree. If they do it well, wherever it is adjacent to us or close enough to us, I want to do exactly what they did, right? Like you effectively go to the same vendors. You say, give me that special. Do you think like that solves the 80-20 for a lot of small operators? Or do you think it still requires some version of going through the detail you talked about?
I think it can solve a lot. It definitely would reduce risk because
Right.
if you're a smaller operator and there's a big operator in your area, to piggyback off of a decade's worth of intelligence that they've already learned the hard way is probably like a smart move from a risk management perspective. Because do you want to bring in all new service providers? Because essentially, and I go through this in the book. Most of the people on the front lines of our operation, which are very different than other manufacturing industries, they're all contractors,
Right.
vendors. They
Right.
don't work directly for you as an employee.
No, they don't, right? And you have like 200 plus vendors on location. So it's like, let's take, for example, you have a big company XYZ, operating, without wanting to say some upstream operator's name, that's drilling wells, and they're drilling wells 5-10% cheaper than anybody else. The well performance on par or better, whatever the case is. Can you go to every single one of those vendors? Extreme cloning, right? So like extreme benchmarking, extreme cloning. I want every single vendor they have. I want them to hey, you guys do work for them. I want the same cost. Maybe you can't give me the same cost, but tell me why you can't.
Well, see,
And part of that might be volume discount or whatever the case is.
one of the benefits of doing that for a small operator is those vendors will be used to working with each other. So
Correct.
if you just take that
100%.
team and bring it over to your operation, it can be very valuable because there's a lot of very small details between vendors that are often overlooked. Like there could be a compatibility issue. And I know this story. There was a big private equity, very well respected in our area of interest, and they decided to use a different vendor for their chemicals, and they destroyed 4 wells. I think over $10 million a piece because there was a compatibility issue. And, I don't think those wells ever recovered. There was remediation done, but again, they decided to take some chemicals that hadn't been thoroughly tested and vetted by any other operator in the area. So they stepped out and took some risk and destroyed 4 very expensive wells. And a big operator, a publicly traded operator with deep pockets, can can stomach that, but a
Biggest,
mid-size
the
operator,
smaller operator can't. And this is
yeah,
where it's got me thinking quite a bit from our time operating on a smaller scale. And I keep coming back to this concept of extreme cloning or whatever. I'm just adding extreme because you did this extreme benchmarking. But like the cloning example to me feels like the right risk reward, which is there's probably very little asymmetric upside in oil and gas operation when you're a smaller operator, right? Said another way, there's very few things you can do unless you just like have true technical viewpoint that like, hey, we're going to do this frac design different than everyone else around here, and here's why, and like here's the analogies in other parts of the basin that's just not being applied here. Okay, very different case. But outside of one of those knobs that you want to turn, the key thing is probably, can I get my operation and my well cost and my well performance as close as possible to the best guy in the basin? It's not going to be the same, but I want it to be as close as humanly possible, right? Like that's your that is a win. So if that's the case, you don't really benefit very much from taking risk, but you
no.
can get screwed in like there's 100 ways to lose if you take any sort of knob dial.
Well,
And so I think the right answer for most of those guys, again, this is a rule. There are always exceptions to that rule, but I think the rule should be just clone what the best in class operator that is within 30 miles of you is doing. And
yeah,
just say to all those vendors, just imagine we are wearing the same clothing that they are and
if
treat this like you would their well.
if that operator, that big operator, is having success, and you're also potentially wanting to monetize to them, it
Yeah,
makes the most sense to just do what they're doing, because it'll make the sales process a lot
even
easier
easier.
when it comes time to
100%.
sell. Because if you're coming with something very different and it doesn't work out, well, you just lost the ability to sell. You lost their respect, and they're not going to be interested in potentially purchasing
100%.
the asset. But from a cost reduction perspective, risk management is critical. I dedicated an entire chapter to it. It's one of the biggest chapters. You must manage the risk if you're going to push on the cost aggressively. If the risk isn't managed, you can have unintended consequences. And this is a
Well, we know
dynamic.
certain operators who cut costs to a point where it was, the locations were not safe.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm an advocate for the view that high cost is high risk usually,
Right.
because if you have a high cost operation, you're most likely engaged in, um, you know, you're engaged in activities that are off the program,
Right.
problems, issues, non-routine, which is based on a lot of work I did for my first book. When you get into non-routine operations, it's when a lot of things can go wrong. So high cost is often an indication of high risk. Low cost is often safer because it's more efficient, it's more streamlined. You just have less equipment, less people, less that can go wrong. So a lot of people think that for some reason, low cost is somehow introducing more risk. Of course, anything is possible, but when done correctly, it actually reduces not only your cost but also your risk. So that's a perception that I'm trying to change with this book, is that somehow going for like extreme cost reduction, like cutting out, if you get your cost down 20, 30, 40%, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's a huge win. But some people might think that for some reason you may be doing something dangerous. How did you cut the cost 40 or 50%? And I don't think that's the case when done correctly. In fact, it can enhance your safety uh, when done properly. Cost reduction can enhance your safety, not increase,
What did
reduce it.
I think one of the concepts which I don't know if they still do, but like was a effectively a safety plus cost focus bonus on the drilling side of operations, which gets a little tricky because that's usually a vendor, right? So they're not your employees. There might be a contractor, and then that's a contractor of a contractor.
Yeah.
Um, What did you think about that impact and that, like across the basin whenever you did that extreme benchmarking?
In other words, like incentivizing
Yeah.
um, efficiency
Faster
with like
drilling. Yeah,
with a
yeah, yeah.
bonus type. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I don't advocate for it in the book um, because it's very it has to be done correctly, and it can be, you know, God forbid if you have um, a bonus program for like finishing a drilling, trying to meet a certain days or a certain frac metric, and you give a bonus to the crew. If something goes wrong, God forbid, it could be utilized to suggest that corners were cut because they wanted to hit the days in order to get a bonus. So you incentivize like some type of bad behavior. The way that I have considered implementing it is that um, stop work authority. I'm a big advocate for a rewarding stop work authority. So if somebody shuts it, what we did at Links was if somebody to remove the stigma from shutting a job down, if somebody stopped the job for safety, we would reward them. So, like, not only are we wanting everybody to be safe, but if you shut the job down, which is often frowned upon because there's a stigma against it, to remove that stigma, we were rewarding people for using stop work authority. We would pay them in gift cards, Amazon gift cards or some other thing that people liked. But Amazon was at the time was valued by the crew, so that's what we used, and it worked. People would shut. Stopping individual work for safety is very easy to do. Everybody does it, but shutting an entire operation down
There's
is
just so
very
much.
it's
It's so scary and daunting for someone to have to do.
extremely rare. So how do you how do you get people to do it? It's and that's one of the best things you can do to reduce your risk, especially if you're engaged in an extreme cost reduction campaign. You have to elevate everybody's awareness because you're going to be doing things a bit faster usually. If you're drilling a well in 20 days and you want to get down to like 7 days, so you want to shave off like the majority, and you want to do a whole bunch of things like that. A lot of stuff is going to be happening a lot faster than what it was before. So everyone's awareness has to go up, and people have, when something's not working right, they have to step up and shut the job down. Most of the undesirable situations that I go through in this new book that have resulted in the CEO being fired, right, from multiple like big companies, could have been prevented if somebody had the courage and the stomach to stop, to step up and stop what was happening. You may lose your job. Like one of the things that I do talk about with younger engineers is um, do not be afraid to step up and stop something if you think it's dangerous. You're actually protecting the executives and upper management and your company. You may get fired for it,
You
but
want to tell the story of a young Matt Hatami being equally neurotic on the subject?
well, yeah, you've heard this story. Like earlier in my career, I was overseas. This is over 20 years ago, working on shale exploration uh, projects. A lot of people don't know that they were occurring way back when during the Barnett, but they were, and they were. A lot of stuff was top secret, but it
Was
was
it
happening.
this was Algeria or
It was various locations overseas, and there was one that they brought a very this was a big a big project, and I was the lead engineer working on the services side, and they brought a very well known famous consultant to assist the operator in being successful on this exploration project, and he wanted to go to the maximum burst pressure of the casing on a frac, intentionally to screen it out and then do some diagnostics for the design of the shale frac job, and that's against common knowledge. You don't go to full max pressure. It's typically like 80% or some
Mhm.
deduct that you're taking off to account for various factors. But he wanted to go all the way, and I refused to do it, and there was essentially a standoff with the oil company and the service company, and I was the one essentially stopping it. And
You were like
this
24 at this time,
yeah,
25.
24, 25. And he tried this oil company, and this guy tried to get me run off location and essentially fired for refusing to do what he wanted because it just wasn't safe. And it was a very stressful situation. The country manager was involved and people back in Houston, and I have to give a lot of respect to Halliburton, and is who I was working for at the time, because they stood behind me. They told the op, and they were going to lose $100 million. I mean, like if we walked, it would have been a hit to the annual like financial situation of the company at that time. But they were willing to do it because I said, we're
They
not
knew
going
it
to,
was a bad idea.
yeah, we're not going to do this. We're not going to. This is against all of our like engineering rules and policies and so on. And eventually, we came to an agreement that we would do what they asked, but we did it in a safe way by moving all the equipment away from the location. And at the last minute, I felt like I had to protect the company, and I told them like, look, if you want to do this operation, I need you to sign this piece of paper that says that you're requesting this. And the guy was very upset about it. He was um, cursing and screaming that he didn't want to sign because he knew that what he wanted to do was high risk. And so eventually he signed. We did what he wanted. No, we were safe about it. Nobody got hurt, but he destroyed the well. He burst the casing on like a massive project for this company. And that's not even the worst part. Okay. Um, we were protected. Like I took a risk career wise to stand up for the right thing, and I've done that throughout my career. I mean, essentially, I'm protecting the executives, right, from a disaster that could have occurred, and our team. And I was willing to lose my job for it, right? But fortunately, that didn't happen, and unfortunately, he did destroy the well. And then there was a big meeting in another country after this whole event transpired. And this famous consultant said in the meeting with the operator that he can't say what happened because his computer was stolen at the airport. So he doesn't know. This was one of the most like well-known consultants
He
in the
just played
oil
dumb.
industry
He just played dumb
globally. Yeah,
after he just played
globally.
dumb afterwards.
And the guy, he was very angry with me, and because I refused to do what he wanted. And at one point, he was trying to say that I was at the time that I was too young to be overseeing this type of operation. He was also bragging about how much money he was making. I mean, this is over 20 years ago, and the guy was telling me, he's like, "Do you know how much I get paid to do this work?" He said, I get paid 5,000 euros a day. How? And then he's asking me, how much do you get paid? And I was like, that's not 5,000 euros a day. That's like crazy. That that's very nice pay back
Very
20
nice.
years
They
ago.
probably got a little stipend, probably a little, a little travel and expense budget too.
So, he was trying to say that because he was so highly paid that he knows, you know, better than I do as to like whether or not this is the right thing to do. And I was trying to explain to him, I was like, sir, I was like, I'm happy that you're making 5,000 euros a day, but I don't think it matters whether or not you're going to destroy this well. Like this is irrelevant. And this guy was a highly educated engineer, multiple Ivy League universities. I mean, this is uh, somebody that's you know knows what that his correlation doesn't make any sense, right? So it was very difficult to stand up to somebody like that early in my career, but it's something that I reinforce, through both of my books, is sometimes to to it's not easy to do the right thing, and that it may be shutting down an entire job, and in order to incentivize that, like, I think it's you want to put systems in place to remove this stigma, so people step up and protect you, even though, like, you're in it. You could be the CEO of a large corporation, like, recently. And I go through a lot of this stuff in the book because I'm trying to bring knowledge from other industries, like what happened with Boeing and the Max 8. That could have been completely prevented. It just depends on how, when you stand up to address these things, how far you're willing to go. And most of the time, people will say something to stop an undesirable situation, but they're not willing to sacrifice their job. Like, they feel
Some version of this is happening at some location every day.
right now. I'm sure right
Right now.
now there's something like this happening. I'll give you a perfect example, and it has to do with cost and so on. I have heard from multiple people that are service company owners, and they have said to me in confidence that they've made fortunes off of the mistakes of the oil company, even though they tell them, like, I wouldn't, don't do XYZ. Like, an oil company who's the client will come to a service company for a particular service, and they may not be seeking advice. They just want to use whatever it is that they're doing, however they want to use it, right? It's not uncommon for the service company to say, we don't recommend that you do that. But most of them, they'll say that, but if they know that the oil company is going to dig themselves a big hole financially, they're not going to go out of their way to stop them because they're getting rich.
Because then they get paid to fix it. They're not aligned necessarily. Like, so long as the disclaimer is given, they're going to make a lot more money letting them make the mistake.
And they allow it. A lot of mistakes occur because the service companies allow them to occur, because there's an incentive there, and also sometimes they're not treated very nicely by the operator, which is more often the case, because they'll say politely, like, sir, I don't recommend that you do that. And then the oil company will say, you don't know what you're talking about. We do this all the time. Okay. And then they get rich, right? They get rich. For me, I like to establish, like, a level of friendship with the service companies so that they help me stay out of trouble. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, look, if I'm doing something wrong, I expect you to say something. Like, I'm trying to, like, I value your opinion. Like, I am hiring you not just for your service and your equipment, but for your brain. And I talk about it in the book. I want to know what you think. I am engaging you. Like, how can we reduce our costs? Many oil companies, they never go to the service companies for help in terms of, and they will help if you ask. It's humbling, okay, for a oil company to ask for help. But if you want to get your costs lower than your competitors, you will do whatever is necessary. You will ask for help from everybody and anybody.
It's an extreme example, but you will ask a consultant to effectively make a decision on your behalf and then instruct the vendor. The problem is, like, the consultant in this example will have no skin in the game, right? Like, it doesn't, it doesn't
their money,
really matter whether or not it works. Like, in your example, right? Dude blew up the well. Like, he got paid no matter what. Like, he probably got hired on to investigate what happened. Where it's like, well, you could pinpoint what happened. He did it.
He did it, and he refused. And after that, it took us a week to figure out what happened. And it's like, we were spending millions of dollars every single day because it was in a remote area. It was a huge, huge operation. And and after the well had essentially burst and then it collapsed, and there was a big meeting, okay? And in that meeting, I was like, look, I think the well has collapsed. And he says, if that young engineer is correct, I will never work in the oil business again, in front of about 100 people. It was collapsed.
And he still worked afterwards. So he was not a man of his word in that example.
No, and what he on the way home, he quietly apologized to me as we were boarding the plane, because it was a remote location, so we had to fly a lot of stuff in there and fly it out. So we're all on the same planes together and so on. We're in line to get on, and he quietly whispers in my ear, "I am sorry, I was wrong." But
That was it. That was the end.
That was it. That was it.
Just on the boarding.
That's right. Just on boarding, and he was devastated. It was devastating because he knew, and when I came back to the base, I was a hero. I was, because they're like, you saved us. Because
everyone's cheering when you land,
Yeah, that's what it was. Like, they were cheering because they're like, you saved us. Like, we would have been on the hook for like $100 million. Like, you saved us. And I was like, I didn't want it. I didn't know what was going to happen, but it wasn't going to be good. So I had to get him. Nobody. The thing was,
you didn't have to pay for beer when you landed back at the base, man.
I just made it up, like this document. I was like, you need to sign. Nobody said anything. I was like, I was sweating because I was like, this is what we're about to do is insane, and this is
actively blowing up a well, right? Like
I didn't know for sure, but I thought high probability. So we moved everything back.
Everyone else, though, right? Like you weren't the only one who was convinced this was going to happen. Like everyone else was convinced this was going to happen.
The team. The funny, a lot of those guys I worked with overseas, they became very good friends. To this day I talk to a lot of them. They're all back in the United States now, but it was you don't know exactly what. I didn't know what was going to happen, but it didn't. Fortunately, we were protected because I got him this. If I didn't have him sign that document, that we didn't have any hard evidence. You know what I mean? So that he was instructing us, even though there was so many at that point, there were so many people involved. At the end of the day, again, when the big meeting happened many months later in another country, of the home country of the oil company, the IOC, these are big IOC. He said he couldn't tell what happened because his computer was stolen at the airport.
And did they steal his brain also? Did they erase his memory he was in Men in Black? What is happening here? Okay, so that, if you summarize that story, that's another example of, let's say, some sort of principal and agency problem around the consultant, right? Because this guy's got no real skin in the game. He was sort of bombarded over location, took over, said, I want to do this. Everyone else disagrees. He doesn't care. He blew up tens of millions of dollars. He's not on the hook for that. He gets paid no matter what. This
was such a huge operation. It was on the quarterly calls for this IOC. It was a huge deal that this happened. Right, it was a very big deal. It wasn't just, some shale well. It was a big deal. So,
and there's some version of this happening all the time.
Unfortunately,
problem, right?
Every day. There was, I mentioned another story. Macondo is a very well-known case. You have a failed negative pressure test, right? You have people on location that have decades of experience. These are some of the most highly knowledgeable individuals running offshore operations, but they didn't have experience dealing with a failed negative pressure test. It's not something that you see every single day. But not too long ago, an operator offset to a well that I was working on had a situation on a multi-well pad where they wanted to run tubing right after a frac job. And the area is under pressure, so they weren't expecting any pressure, but they had 100 pounds on it. It's not very much. They opened the well to confirm, and it's trickling, so it's flowing. So now you have a flowing well. You have a live well, and you're not supposed to just. This is a failed negative pressure test. The well is not static. You're not supposed to go run in the hole open to the world. And the crew refused, and you got to give them a lot of credit. The crew that was going to run the tubing refused to do it, and this situation worked its way all the way up to the CEO of this company, who essentially told them to man up and run in the hole.
I think they say the CEO. If I recall correctly, Tommy, he did not say man up. He said something a little more aggressive, a little more colorful than man up.
Yeah, which I can't repeat, but you have to think, like, how is it that we still didn't learn, like at the highest level, you still, what happened on Macondo. Maybe it's not fresh in your mind, but it's so serious that you have a failed negative pressure test and you're going to ignore it. Why would somebody do that? Because they want
to. The crew is if let's just think through this from a first principles perspective. The crew is incentivized to work. They get paid to work. If they come to you and say, we don't feel comfortable doing the job, what does that tell you?
Stop. What it tells you is stop immediately.
You're effectively getting on a plane and the pilot is saying, it is not a good idea to take off.
But you'd be surprised at how often that is ignored on the front lines, unbeknownst to management in the office, that you have a service provider saying hey, I don't feel I've seen it so many times. I don't feel comfortable, but somebody saying no, we're going to keep going. Why would you do that? Because you want to run tubing. And I go through examples in the new book of near misses and events that are ignored. Some of the biggest ones that are known are Chernobyl. Why did they continue with their test after there were a ton of red flags? Because they wanted to show a successful test, and they ignored what was going on, caused a nuclear disaster. Right? The same dynamic occurs in multiple industries. You're so focused on a specific result that you ignore the red flags going up because you just want to accomplish what you want to accomplish, right? I mean, it's the same thing with invoices. The path of least resistance is just to approve them, even though they're higher than what they should be. There's red flags with our system, but we're going to continue to do what we've been doing. And the costs aren't going down, but it's the path of least resistance. So I'm not going to change.
Yeah.
The last action, I know we're trying to get a group of actions to deliver 10 or 20%.
Next action to cut costs.
It goes along the same lines, but it could potentially be the most powerful. And I think you'll enjoy this last action relative to what you're currently doing with artificial intelligence, because it's using similar technology. But after this podcast, what I recommend, if you're the CEO of a big oil company, is ask your team from each division to send you a copy of their current drilling, completion, and production procedures. Ask for a current copy of whatever's being used today. Then ask for a copy from 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, and 2 years ago, or go back as far as you want. Then, once you have all of them, look and see how they have changed. And what you may find is that they are identical. So
there's no way they've changed.
I know, but that's most likely the case. So here's the thing: if they are identical, which is pretty much probably the case in most situations, that the procedure that they're using today is identical to 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, maybe even 2 or 3 years ago. It's the same thing. If it is the same, the next question you need to ask yourself is, all of the learnings that have occurred over the past several months and years, if they are not in these procedures, then where are they? And how are we operating on the front lines and putting this information right in front of the face of the guys that are going to execute and determine our success or failure? Often, this is going to determine, based on history, whether or not I am on the CEO departures list in the book.
Here we go.
Because if you're not incorporating learnings from your operation, your
And
company,
the learnings are more or less errors. Let's be clear. There are, we made a mistake. Here was a failure. Here was a cost over whatever it is.
or
It's
successes.
some,
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the
yeah,
errors are what keeps you off the list. You don't
correct.
want to be
Yeah.
on that CEO departures list due to
Well, I
poor
wouldn't
risk
mind being on
management.
the list. You get paid quite a bit to get fired, man.
That can be true, but it's not a good thing. I research a lot of companies, and there's some pretty serious events that have occurred. Engineering mistakes, and there is one, like, when these events occur, they go and they talk to the executives many years later, and it sits on your mind, for all those years. There's one in particular where there was a very big chemical accident in India, I believe, and thousands of people were injured, and it haunted that executive all the way up until into his 90s, that event occurred. So that, what can we do to operate with the highest levels of intelligence so that our frontline team has all the information right in front of their face in order to execute, right? So there's a lot of ways to incorporate artificial intelligence into that and have a more dynamic procedure as opposed to a static procedure. Of course, you have to have it because you want to hand something out to the vendors, but most of the time we're using stuff in Word or PDF.
Mm-hmm.
And I have, interesting. There's so many stories on this, but one of the more recent is there was a colleague operating a large oil company, and they lost an entire well due to mud contamination. They lost a well, they lost a drill string, $5 million event, $5 million loss. They did an investigation. They found out what the issue was. It was the mud was contaminated on the surface due to an issue on the rig. A few weeks later, the exact same thing happens on another rig. Another $5 million loss. And when I was hearing about this, I asked them, after the first event, and you found out what caused it, how did you uh, distribute that information to the entire company? And they sent an email on it, and it was discussed at safety meetings. So this is a standard process. But
Mm-hmm.
when it happened on the next rig, it was a team that had just come from days off. They didn't have a chance to go through their emails, and you're getting hit with so many emails that it's difficult to go through every single one of them, with an extreme level of detail. So they didn't see that information.
Yeah.
It wasn't discussed. It happened
No
several
one
weeks
got
ago.
warned of, like, here are the top 10 things that have happened to our company or in the area in the last,
Yeah.
quarter or
You
whatever
can,
it
you
is.
can do that. You can incorporate, if you just want to incorporate checklists or attachments to your procedures, or you can go with a more dynamic procedure that's updated in real time. And one option is to utilize mobile devices and apps, and this is being incorporated in other industries, in which, for every single step you go to, a site, an internet site, or you have a mobile app, and you click a button, and it goes through like what you should look for. Here's like cases that have happened. Here's pictures. Pilots today, very often no longer use a paper flight bag. Everything is digital. So like you can click through the steps, your checklists, and look at like issues that have occurred recently, near misses. It's all like right in front of your face. So like, for example, if you're gonna change your mud system, or you're about to do a negative pressure test, or run guns, or open up the well, or whatever the case is, there's 1,000 different things. You could just open up your dynamic procedure with pictures, and it's updated in real time and gives you step by step checklists and so on. It keeps, it enhances the ability for your team to operate with the intelligence of your entire operation for decades, as opposed to a static procedure that most likely hasn't changed for the past several months or years. So there's a lot
Or
of
we're going to have to
options.
create an oil field anonymous where people call you late night, you get a little, little radio show going, and they tell you about the biggest mistakes they've been hearing in the field, and then you get to share them.
You know, a lot of people reach out to me because of Oilfield Survival Guide every so often, and it's nice. It's nice that they share, that they like the book and so on. And but I hear about events, and most of them are preventable. I would say all of them, and that's my mentality. Is that with knowledge and intelligence, all of this stuff can be prevented, which reduces your costs,
Right.
and your risk. So it's just like, does your team have that intelligence, and are they able to act on it? So like, one of the best things you can do for your company in terms of cost reduction is, because people are so critical, in my opinion, the most important is increase their knowledge, increase their intelligence by buying the book.
By buying the book. This is a little shameless plug. Okay, let's do this. Let's wrap up. Summary. Okay, what are the main action steps that we went through here?
Okay, so the book has over 700 actions. The main ones that we went through here to get a quick 10 or 20% that you can implement immediately right after this podcast are, first, for the next 60 days, document every single mistake that your team finds on the invoices and tickets, and then utilize that information within your systems and processes to aggressively push on your costs at the point of the invoice being presented before it is signed and approved. That is a huge opportunity to aggressively get your costs down by addressing what I refer to as shenanigans to increase the price on the invoice before it is
Little
paid.
scams they're running.
Yeah. So that's number
Okay,
one.
so
Number two is to perform a full statistical analysis on the structure of your costs to look for opportunities. You could run a Monte Carlo. You could build a fancy model and just run 1,000 different scenarios on like what because there's uncertainty with what happens. What is on the AFE is a static number.
I
It's
mean, in
not.
many ways, you could probably go to every single vendor and push them to do the work and effectively say, hey, look, you're billing me on this structure. If you build this exact same well on a different way that you price out bids, tell me how that payment would have worked out, right? Like, structure me out what the payment is.
Or tell them, like, this is what I want to pay.
Yeah.
Like, this is what I'm going to pay. I'm going to find and we didn't really talk about this at all, is that as the operator, you have to force the efficiencies onto the vendors. They're not going to do it unless you are pushing on them, right? Because they have to be incentivized to be more efficient. So your cost reduction initiative has to be aggressive on them so that they get their costs down.
This is Matt Hatami coming onto location with the vendors in a Santa Claus outfit, handing them all lumps of coal and saying, you need to go and figure out a way to reduce your bill.
There's no other way. Like, that's how it's going to be. Otherwise your costs aren't going down. So, be aggressive. And at the point, when with the invoices, because that's at the end of the day, all the hard work comes down to that number. Whatever it is, that's your CapEx, that's your OpEx. It's critical in the free cash flow formula. So that's number two. Number three is go to 10, minimum of 10, bid 10 companies. Just that alone can get you significant cost reduction. So you bid 10. Number four is extreme benchmarking. We're looking at the details of every little operational step to reduce costs from our competitors. And then number five has to do with process and procedures and systems. How are we ensuring that our operation is executing at the highest levels of intelligence with all of our knowledge and experience from the past several decades? How are we ensuring that our team has that right in front of their face before they're about to execute and have success or failure? Would have prevented most undesirable situations, keeps you off the executive departures list, helps you get your costs down. Very powerful. So very simple, 5 actions.
Very simple, 5 actions. And then action number 6 is buy the book. That's action number 6.
Buy the book for every person at your company, all your service providers. I think
your mother-in-law, it could be anybody, anyone
if you love. If you love
if you love your mother-in-law, get her the book.
Free cash flow, then you will buy the book. If you don't love free cash flow, then you will not buy the book. I
noticed that you made the book green.
I don't know if you picked up on this, and I haven't said this to anybody yet, but do you see this symbol on the book? What does it look like to you? It's a good indication of what you think about. What does this symbol look like?
It's cash.
it's there's multiple. It's S for shale,
Okay, here we
and
go.
this is a drill string,
This is a
right?
drill
This is a
string.
drill
Okay.
bit.
Okay.
Shale operations, but it's
Oh,
also
yeah.
it's also a
Dollar.
dollar
It's
sign.
the dollar sign. It's also a
Yes.
dollar sign.
Most people don't pick up on that. They
I
either
picked up on the
see.
green dollar sign, Matt. So
Well,
it looks like cash
this is basically $1 billion in value
right there.
right there for
Available on Amazon.
30
Available on
bucks.
Amazon.
You know,
Available on Amazon. Where do people want to contact you if they want to get their copy of this book signed? Where
well,
who
if they want to contact me, they can reach out on LinkedIn
Okay.
or X, or I'm sure a lot of people know me. They'll find me somehow. I'm
They'll
sure.
find you
So
somehow. And if they want to do a really big deal, then they'll reach out to me first before I contact you so that we could start a new co and I can cut a nice fat deal fee. Doesn't that sound about right?
that sounds good. If anybody needs help, I always tell people, look, if you ever need any help or advice, or you just have a question, feel free to just reach out. And people do, and of course, there's a big disclaimer in the book that you always want to do your own due diligence before implementing any of these actions. Many of them are extremely aggressive. We only discussed 5 that are simple that you can implement immediately, but the stuff in the book is not for everybody. And you want to make sure that you perform your own analysis before implementing anything, because
I'm glad we did the disclaimer here.
everybody's
Just in
situation
case.
is different.
I like the disclaimer. I'm always about the risk mitigation, man.
Yeah.
Okay, well, good deal. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate this. For everyone listening, go buy the book. Go buy the book for your mother-in-law, only if you love her, and everyone that you know. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Raj, for having me on your podcast. I greatly enjoyed it.
Absolutely, me too. Bye.
Bye.